When I was a kid, my dad lived out of suitcases and hotel rooms more than at home. His company was expanding like a wildfire, opening new stores all over the country, and he was the man they sent ahead to make sure everything turned on and lit up the first day. In the summer of 2002, they stationed him in a quiet corner of Pennsylvania for a longer project, long enough that he decided to drag my mother and me along instead of flying back and forth every other weekend. We ended up in one of those brand new housing developments at the edge of a town that looked old enough to remember the Civil War. The streets were laid out, the lamp posts installed, but half the houses still stood empty with for sale signs slowly bleaching in the sun. Behind the last row of homes, the trees began abruptly, a dense wall of pine and oak that at night turned into a single black mass pressing against the backyards. I met Jamie there, in that in-between place where suburbia ran out and the forest began. We were both 12, both bored, and both more at home in dirt than in neatly painted kitchens. For a city kid like me, the woods were a revelation. The local kids had carved out hidden bike trails between the trees, hammered together makeshift ramps over streams, and traced old, abandoned railroad tracks half buried under moss and weeds. Mears Brook, the nearest town, had been around since the early 1800s, with a proud little museum, a few churches, and decades of history no one my age cared about. There wasn't much to do. We rode, we explored, we climbed, we pushed deeper into the trees until the hum of the highway disappeared and all that was left was birdsong and the creak of branches. One particularly dead Sunday, out of sheer desperation, Jamie and I ended up in the town museum. It smelled like dust and old paper. The docent's voice droned on about founding families and ironworks while we trailed behind, too polite to leave, too bored to listen. I was on the verge of zoning out completely when another kid asked the man at the desk about the lost town. The employee laughed, the kind of laugh adults use when they want to close a subject, and called it an old local legend. A sister town, he said vaguely, somewhere out in the woods that had just vanished. He waved it away with his hand, but the word vanished stuck in my brain like a burr. On the walk home, I pressed Jamie for details. He claimed he didn't know much, only that people used to scare each other with stories about a town that was there one day and gone the next, half a century or more ago. No records, no photos, not even a clear name. Just a rumor that there had once been another cluster of lights in the forest, and then there wasn't. At 12, that kind of ambiguity is a drug. Over the following weeks, the legend fermented quietly at the back of my mind. Then everything suddenly accelerated. One afternoon, we were out in the woods, balancing planks over a narrow stream to make a bike ramp, when a group of older teenagers pushed past us. They had flashlights looped around their wrists, a clinking backpack full of beer, and that nervous, over-loud laughter kids use when they're pretending not to be scared. They didn't look at us. They headed straight down an overgrown trail leading deeper into the trees. "I know where they're going," Jamie muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "To the lost town," I said, and the excitement in my voice betrayed me. He hesitated, then nodded, shoulders sagging like someone who'd just given away a secret he'd been warned not to repeat. The way he described it made the town feel half like a rite of passage and half like a dare. Everyone in Mears Brook had heard of it. No one could say exactly where it was. An older boy had supposedly gone looking in the 70s and never come back. They didn't find his body until years later, miles from anywhere anyone knew. He was probably high, I said, trying to puncture the story. Besides, we've got GPS now. My dad has one in the car. No way we get lost out there. Jamie didn't look convinced. The woods were his home, and he knew how easy it was for trees and hillsides to blend into one another until everything looked the same. But I kept coming back to the same thought. If there had been a sister town, it had to be connected by something, a road, a rail line, a lake. People don't just build a whole settlement in the middle of nowhere without some artery tying it to the rest of the state. So, when my parents announced that we'd be heading home in less than a week, the legend stopped being an interesting ghost story and calcified into a mission. There would be no next summer to look for it. It was now or never. On the Saturday before we left, my father hosted a barbecue in our half-furnished backyard for his new employees and a few neighbors. Smoke from the grill drifted up into the slowly reddening sky. Laughter and country music leaked through the open back door. Inside, Jamie and I sat in front of my Nintendo 64, pretending the outside world didn't exist. What I didn't tell him was that, in my room upstairs, a backpack sat ready. Water bottles, flashlight, camera, a roll of bandages, and a can of red spray paint. I had spent every morning that week in the local library, scouring old maps and municipal records for any mention of another town near Mears Brook, and coming up empty. If there was anything left to find, it wouldn't be on paper. "Do you want to go to the woods?" I asked, setting my controller down like it was nothing. Jamie glanced at the window, at the slant of afternoon light. "Yeah," he said too quickly. "Sure, if you want." I stood up, grabbed his hand, and pulled him to the front door, scooping up my backpack on the way. By the time he realized I hadn't just packed snacks, we had already left the sidewalks behind and were crunching down a narrow dirt path toward the old railroad. He stopped dead when he saw the can of paint clipped to the side pocket. "You're not serious," he said. "Katie, it's our last chance," I cut in. "We'll follow the tracks for an hour. We mark the trees. If we don't see anything, we turn back. No one will even know we're gone." In the end, I think he said yes, because he didn't want to disappoint me. Looking back now, that might be the worst thing I ever did. Turn the boy who liked me into the boy who would follow me into hell. The tracks were ancient, half-eaten by moss and vines. At first, the novelty of walking along them swallowed my nerves. We laughed, joked, counted how many ties were missing. Then the forest thickened, the light thinned, time stretched. It felt like we'd only been walking 45 minutes, but when Jamie checked his watch, the hands pointed to 5. "That's wrong," I said immediately. "We left after 2. It can't be 5. He didn't argue, but the unease in his eyes deepened. We were debating whether to turn back when I saw it. Off to our right, through a break in the foliage, something that wasn't quite forest. A darker rectangle, edges too straight to be natural. It was far enough away that we could have pretended we hadn't seen it. Neither of us did. We left the tracks and pushed between the trees, Jamie stopping every few steps to spray a red X on a trunk. The undergrowth thickened, then thinned, and then, all at once, the trees parted and the church appeared. It was smaller than the churches in town, with weather-beaten clapboard walls and a sagging roof. No steeple, no cross, just a single wooden door and clouded windows that hid whatever lay inside. The sign above the entrance had long since faded to blank wood. Time had scraped its name away. The front door had no knob, just a solid slab of timber carved with overlapping triangles and lines. I pressed my shoulder into it. It didn't budge. We circled the building and found a side door with a simple latch. It opened as if someone inside had just walked through. The pastor's office felt like a room someone had left in a hurry and never returned to. An old desk was buried under papers and books written in a language I didn't recognize. Portraits of stern men and women in dark clothes stared down at us from the walls, their painted eyes following us as we moved. A pair of shoes lay abandoned in the corner. A coat hung on the back of a chair, the fabric so brittle it seemed like it might turn to dust at a touch. Jamie found the list of names on the desk, rows of cramped handwriting, most of them crossed out. At the very bottom, one of the only names left untouched hovered alone above a date I couldn't translate. My skin prickled. I wanted to know who it belonged to, almost as much as I wanted to get out of that room. The portraits made it worse. One, painting in particular, a young woman with tired eyes and a tight mouth, never looked away from me. The accusation in her gaze felt personal, like she knew exactly which boundary we were about to cross. The slow groan of shifting beams above us snapped everything into focus. The ceiling sagged, splinters rained down, and then a section of the roof gave way with a thunderclap. Jamie shoved me through the doorway just as rotten timber crashed down where we had been standing seconds before. When the dust settled, the office was gone. Our way back had been sealed under a tangle of wood and plaster. The only place left to go was the sanctuary. Stepping into the chapel felt like stepping into a throat. What little light filtered through the grimy stained glass was swallowed before it reached the floor. Rows of pews, rotted and collapsing, framed a narrow aisle that led to a raised platform at the front. I thought at first it was a pulpit. It wasn't. It was a crucifix. The statue of Christ towered over us, arms outstretched, head bowed. The paint had peeled off almost everywhere, except for the wounds. The blood was still there, a glossy, unnatural red that refused to dull. Even worse were the eyes. Somehow, despite the decay, the eyes remained sharp, clear, and, God help me, aware. We tried to focus on practical things, breaking windows to let more light in, searching for a back exit. The glass shattered, but the room didn't brighten. It was as if the chapel itself rejected daylight. Jamie, stubborn to the point of self-destruction, started testing the floor near the front. His foot hit a hollow spot. He dropped to his knees, brushed aside the dust, and revealed the outline of a hatch. I told him no. I begged him. 2 minutes, he promised. Just 2. We'd go down together, and if either of us said up, we would turn around and leave. He said it with that earnest, fierce conviction only 12-year-olds have. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe I was still in control. When he lifted the hatch, heat rolled up from below, thick and stale, like the breath of something that had been sleeping for a very long time. The spiral staircase cut into the rock looked utterly out of place, too precise, too deliberate. The church above us might have been built by farmers and carpenters. Whatever carved those stairs had different standards. Jamie went first with his lighter. I followed, flashlight in hand, counting each step like a charm against the mounting panic. Down there, beneath the church, the air felt wrong, as if the space itself didn't belong under this patch of earth. The chamber at the bottom was almost bare. A desk in one corner, piled with mildewed papers, and in the center, dominating everything, stood the demon. It filled the room. 12 feet of carved stone, thick tail curling around the pedestal, torso twisted as if it were about to step forward. Its hands were half open, clawed fingers slightly spread, like it was waiting for something to fall into its grasp. Horns arched back from its skull. Its face, what I could stand to look at of it, was a study in hateful calm. It had been positioned to face the staircase directly. It had been placed here to watch the only entrance. Whoever built this place hadn't wanted worshippers. They'd wanted a jailer. Neither of us spoke. We moved along the wall, keeping the demon in the corner of our vision, too afraid to look away, too afraid to meet its gaze head on. I remember the scrape of my shoes on stone, the way my heartbeat echoed in my ears louder than our footsteps. When I finally swung the flashlight up toward Jamie's face to check on him, something else appeared in the beam. Another face, immediately beside his. It wasn't a trick of shadows. It was the demon's face, suddenly inches from his, as if it had bent down off its pedestal to inspect him. The stone mouth was twisted in fury. The eyes were pits, and somehow, impossibly, they were lined up with mine. My mind broke for a moment. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. My body went cold and hot all at once, like my blood had turned to ice and fire at the same time. The only thing that snapped me free was Jamie's own scream as he turned and saw what was staring over his shoulder. We bolted. Batteries, camera, all of it hit the floor and rolled away. We ran for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time, lungs burning, breaths tearing out of us in ragged sobs. Behind us, something enormous began to move, stone on stone. That's what it sounded like. Each impact reverberated through the staircase. For a delirious, nauseating second, I believed the steps themselves would shatter under our feet and drop us back down into the thing's reach. We somehow made it out into the chapel. The hatch slammed but didn't latch, and beneath our feet it thudded and shuddered like something was ramming it from below. We sprinted for the door, slammed our shoulders into it, and this time the carved wood gave way. We hit the ground outside in a tangle of limbs and grass and panic. We ran until we hit the tracks. Then we ran the tracks until we couldn't run anymore. By the time we stumbled into the circle of flashlight beams and shouting voices, the sun was nearly gone and the world had gone bluish-grey at the edges. The police wrote it off as kids getting lost in the woods. We never told anyone what we'd found under the church. Not our parents, not the officers, not the therapists who later tried to pry the story out of me with soft voices and notebooks. We carried it alone. 2 days later, we drove away from Mears Brook earlier than planned. My father got called to another opening. My mother cried, but only about the move. Jamie didn't come to say goodbye. Years later, I would find that absence more merciful than cruel. For a while, I managed to file the whole summer away as a fever dream. Something terrible had happened, yes, but maybe it had all been in my mind. Maybe the demon had been just a weird statue in a creepy old cellar, and my fear had done the rest. Then Mears Brook started to disappear. It began with small things. My parents stopped mentioning the town by name. When I brought it up, they squinted as if I'd mispronounced something and changed the subject. The store my father opened there fell off his company's website. The town's homepage returned a 404 error. The local newspaper's archive went blank. The school's sites vanished. I dug out the police report I'd tucked into a folder under my bed. It was still there, still stamped, still real. I taped it to the ceiling above my bed so I'd see it every morning and every night, proof that the place had existed, that we had been there. One day I looked up and the text was gone. The paper was old, fragile, and utterly blank. Only my memory remained. No records, no documents, no photos, no digital footprint. And the more I thought about the demon's hungry stillness under the church, the more I realized what it had been eating all along. Not just flesh, history, names, everything that says we were here. For 13 years, I did what most people do with guilt. I buried it under work, alcohol, and routine. I lied to therapists. I moved states. I tested how much whiskey it took to sleep without dreaming. It worked for a while. Until one day, the tricks stopped working. The panic attacks came back harder than ever, and I couldn't convince myself anymore that what I remembered was just a breakdown. I booked a flight to Pennsylvania. The plan, if you could call it that, was simple and impossible. I would find any trace of Mears Brook, prove to myself that it once existed, and maybe, impossibly, confirm that the thing under the church was gone. I drove back roads and backwoods, stopped at diners and gas stations, asked about empty stretches of highway where there should have been more. Every now and then, the landscape would hiccup. A patch of forest would look wrong. Trees washed out and brittle, undergrowth sparse and colorless, air just a little too still. Places that felt like scars. I followed the scars. They led me, eventually, to a mid-size university town. Young people everywhere. Vintage shops and coffee bars. Flyers stapled to bulletin boards in chaotic layers. One of those flyers snagged my eye because it was too bright, too new, and it fluttered directly into my path on a gust of wind. University Museum of State History, it said at the top. Beneath that, new exhibition, Judeo-Christian relics, 13th, 14th century. At the bottom, in smaller print, one artifact was singled out, a statue of a little-known demon. My stomach turned cold. I walked into the museum with shaking hands and paid for a ticket like any other visitor. I shuffled along with a guided tour through pottery, paintings, relics, until we came to a room with double doors and a sign warning against flash photography. The docent opened the doors with a flourish. There it was, bigger than in my memory, set on a broad granite plinth draped in red velvet. Spotlights angled up from below, casting massive shadows on the ceiling. The face was turned outward now, mouth slightly open, as if it had been interrupted mid-movement. But everything about it was the same. The coiled tail, the heavy limbs, the sense that the stone wasn't quite as dead as it pretended. I barely heard the docent's patter about iconography and medieval fears. I only heard the single phrase she lingered over, Matar Axis, a demon that devours not merely flesh, but memory, lineage, and presence. According to the placard, the statue belongs to a private collector named Jameson Scott, a man whose name I recognized vaguely from tech blogs, a late-in-life genius who had, out of nowhere, revolutionized surgical robotics and several other fields in the span of 6 short years, just when age should have been slowing him down. He gave a public lecture that night about his collection. He stood on stage, young, handsome, slightly exhausted in that way the rich like to romanticize. He joked about investors and patents, made the crowd laugh, and then put a photo of the demon up on the projection screen like he was introducing an old friend. He called Matar Axis a predator of stories, described how any person it consumed would be erased from time so thoroughly that no one would remember they'd walked the earth, told the audience how, according to scraps of forgotten lore, certain ancient communities had tried to tame it, feeding it chosen sacrifices in exchange for protection and unnaturally long lives. Listening to him, it was obvious he believed every word. It was equally obvious he thought he could manage the cost. After the talk, when he tried to slip out a back door flanked by security, I did something reckless. I shouted down the alley that his symbols wouldn't hold the demon forever. He stopped. The SUV braked. A window slid down. A pair of dark eyes met mine. He knew my name. Not just the one on my ID, the one I had left behind in a collapsed church when I was 12. When I stepped into his penthouse later that night, flanked by silent armed men, I expected either a seduction or a threat. Instead, I got something stranger. Jameson Scott spoke about Matar Axis like a business partner he hated but needed. He admitted that the symbols etched around the base of the statue in the museum were copied from the church door in the woods. He admitted they wouldn't hold forever. He also admitted to something else. Years ago, when his hands first began to shake and his eyes started to fail, he had gone hunting for anything, any superstition, any relic that might give him back time. He found the demon. He bought the statue when the state, baffled and cash-strapped, put it up for auction. He tried to destroy it with every tool money could buy. Fire, dynamite, heavy machinery. Nothing worked. The only thing that did anything at all were symbols and names. The first sacrifice was the man whose name had been carved into the granite in some forgotten script. Scott found him, presented him to the demon, and watched as the man disappeared from records and memories alike. 6 years later, Scott stood in front of me looking 30 years younger than he should have. He had changed his name, started a new company, and told himself the world needed him alive. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Destroy the statue? I've tried. Put it back where I found it. It doesn't work like that." What he really wanted was my compliance, my consent, my willingness to walk calmly into the demon's mouth so that he could sleep at night, believing the cost had been paid willingly. I told him to go to hell. He smiled, thin and humorless, and had me knocked out. When I woke up, it was on cold museum marble. My wrists were zip-tied. The demon loomed above me on its pedestal, velvet pushed back to reveal a band of engraved writing at the base. Among the angular, ancient characters, one word had been added recently in the Latin alphabet: my name. In the far corner of the room, slumped against the wall, hands bound behind him, sat Jamie. He was older, harder. Blood clung to the front of his shirt where a bullet had torn through him earlier that night. But his eyes were the same. When they met mine, all the years between then and now collapsed into nothing. He told me, in a low, shaking voice, how he had survived when Mears Brook disappeared, how he had watched his father and brother blink out of existence while he somehow remained anchored, as if the demon needed him as a compass, how he had followed the statue from town to town, job to job, joining local police, then private security, chasing the thing through the wreckage it left behind. He had joined Scott's team the only way Scott would hire him, by beating out every other candidate in hand-to-hand combat. Scott never knew that the man he'd brought on to guard him was the boy who'd first escaped the demon under the church. Jamie had been trying to keep people away from the statue ever since, repainting symbols when Scott's team slacked, feeding the tech billionaire false leads whenever the name Katie Link appeared where it shouldn't. He had done everything short of blowing up the museum to keep me out. And now, here I was, lying on the floor beneath the one thing in the world that had wanted me longer than anyone else. The plan, he whispered then, was insane. It was also the only one we had. We weren't going to run from the demon. We were going to lock it away. The marks Scott's people had drawn around the exhibition room were crude imitations of what Jamie had found in the church. They kept the demon still as long as it was fed and worshipped. But to truly seal it, Jamie had learned the mark had to be drawn on a living soul and blessed in a way no sterile ritual could fake. The demon had to try to take that soul and fail. He knew that because he had tried it once already with someone else, and the result had been catastrophic. We didn't have time to argue about the ethics. The stone above us began to move. You can hear it if you've heard it once. That grinding, bone-deep vibration of something impossibly heavy shifting its weight. Jamie somehow slipped his restraints, cut mine, and dragged me to my feet. We ran. We crashed through the gift shop, set off every alarm in the building, hurled a table through a window, and stole a Jeep from the far edge of the parking lot, while Scott's men scrambled to figure out how their perfect execution had gone sideways. A white SUV followed us at a careful distance down the highway, its headlights never quite closing, as if it knew exactly where we were headed and saw no reason to rush. Jamie turned off the main road sooner than I expected. He veered into the trees, following deer paths and game trails, as if he'd been rehearsing this drive in his mind for years. The forest swallowed us, branches whipped the windshield, mud splattered up the sides of the Jeep. We hit the tracks. We hit the church. The front door gave way at a touch, as if the building recognized us. The hatch inside was still open. The heat below was worse than I remembered. The demon was waiting at the bottom. This time it wasn't pretending to be stone. Its eyes tracked us as we descended. Its tail wound around the base of the stairs like a snake. Its chest rose and fell with slow, terrible breaths that stirred the hot air. It had been following the statue, surfing through existence on a wave of erased towns and forgotten families. And now it was back where it had started, back under a church in the woods, facing the same two children who had once run from it. No symbols, no altar, no sanctuary. Jamie stepped forward. The pull started almost immediately. It wasn't physical at first. It was a sensation somewhere just below my ribs, like a hook had caught the center of me and given it a gentle, testing tug. The demon's gaze found mine and held it. My vision tunneled. The room fell away until all I could see was that widening mouth, the endless dark inside it, the promise that if I stepped through, there would be nothing left of me to mourn. The second pull was harder. My feet shuffled forward of their own accord. My fingers twitched at my sides. Somewhere behind me, Jamie swore softly. Then there was the sharp sting of marker against my skin. He had yanked the collar of my shirt aside and drawn a perfect, unbroken symbol over my heart. It burned like a brand. The air around us seemed to twist. For a split second, I wasn't sure if he'd just made it easier for the demon to see where to bite. The third pull snapped me forward and then snapped me back. The demon screamed. The sound shook the chamber, rattled dust from the ceiling, made my teeth ache. It howled in a language no one human had taught it, a cascade of rage and hunger denied. Its body convulsed on the pedestal. Its tail whipped so hard against the far wall that rock shattered. Jamie threw me over his shoulder before I had fully returned to my body. He carried me up the stairs like I weighed nothing, every step costing him a fresh surge of blood from the wound in his side. Behind us, the demon clawed at something we couldn't see, something tethered to the mark on my chest that wouldn't let go. We burst into the chapel and into the waiting sight of Jameson Scott. He had a gun leveled at Jamie's head and men at his back, ready to finish what he'd started. The floor trembled under our feet. The hatch glowed faintly at the edges. Scott shouted something about duty and sacrifice, promised the world progress in exchange for our lives, told me I should be honored. Jamie met my eyes. For a heartbeat, the three of us stood on the edge of a decision no one could take back. Then Jamie moved. He slammed his shoulder into Scott. The two of them toppled together into the open hatch. The gun skittered away. Their bodies vanished into the dark. A heartbeat later, Scott's screams rose from below, raw with terror. He begged, he bargained, he promised the demon anything, everything, if it would only take me instead. The more he pleaded, the more the shaking intensified. Jamie somehow climbed back up, bleeding worse than before, face white and jaw clenched. I grabbed his arms and hauled him the rest of the way, dragging him onto the floor just as the hatch flared bright white and then went black, the wood around its edges searing into a fused, glassy rim. The church groaned. The walls buckled. Beams cracked overhead. We ran. The doorway threw itself open in front of us, as if pushed from the other side. We stumbled out into daylight. Behind us, with a sound like the world exhaling, the church collapsed in on itself. Dust billowed into the trees. When it cleared, nothing remained but a jagged mound of rubble. Somewhere beneath it, under stone and earth and rotted timber, the door to the demon's den had been welded shut. Not destroyed, not gone, but sealed. Jamie spent a month in the hospital. 4 days after we left the woods, Jameson Scott and everything he had ever built went the way of Mears Brook. His company, his patents, his interviews, his plaques, all of it slid out of existence like a file dragged to the trash and emptied. The world adjusted without noticing. Technology rolled back a few incremental miracles. People wondered, briefly, why certain devices stopped working, then went back to their lives. Jamie and I didn't go back to ours. We had seen what one man with too much power and too little conscience could do with a single hungry god. We had seen what happened to a town no one remembered. Somewhere between the ruined church and the hospital ward, we made a decision. We would spend whatever time we had left hunting the next Jameson Scotts and the next Matar Axes, the greedy ones, the ones who find old things buried in the wrong places and decide the cost is worth paying as long as someone else pays it. You won't read about what we do. If we're any good at it, you'll never know. I have changed names in this story, moved towns, bent roads, twisted dates. If you tried to follow the trail I laid down here, you'd end up lost in the woods 100 miles from where you meant to go. That's deliberate. The door we sealed is still out there under a pile of rotten beams and dirt. Someday, the earth might shift. A storm might wash away the topsoil and reveal old, scorched stone. If that day comes, I don't want you anywhere near it. Maybe you'll forget you ever read this. Maybe tomorrow it will feel like a dream your waking mind can't quite hold on to. Maybe, years from now, you'll reach for a memory of this story and find only a faint impression of unease. If that happens, be grateful. It means for now, the demon is still eating someone else.